and welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gruss at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions.
All right, so I'm going to switch over topics a little bit, and now we're going to start talking about growth and regrowth, um, and really in relation to grazing. And so what I'm going to be covering is kind of that balancing roots recovery. We're going to be talking about growth, when it occurs, how that regrowth is occurring and where it's occurring from, grazing heights and grazing intervals, and then kind of putting it together and how different stocking options impacts this. And as you're going to probably notice throughout it, a lot of these topics overlap quite a bit, but we'll go from there. I always like to think of grazing as kind of a balancing act. Typically, I like to think about it as a three-legged stool. We have our persistence, quality, and our yield. And if we only focus on one, typically one of the others is going to fall through. So if we're only grazing super young and young plants, not giving it time to recover and grazing it low, we're going to see persistence go down. Um, and so it's kind of focusing on balancing all three and being able to have those plants persist as long as possible. I know most people probably would not be very happy if they seeded a new pasture stand and it only lasted them a few years. And so it's putting all these pieces together. And one of the very important big aspects is carbohydrate stores, as we're thinking about grazing intervals, because a lot of our plants rely on these carbohydrates to regrow following a grazing event. And so if we're looking at the image on the image on the right, sorry, I'm going to get my laser on, we can see that as that plant starts to grow, we rely on those root carbohydrates for the regrowth of that plant. And then once the plant gets to typically 6 to 8 inches tall, it starts to be able to photosynthesize enough to start to restore those carbohydrates in the roots. And so we start to restore them. And if we start to graze too early, we're just going to constantly be depleting them. And so sometimes when we have these continuous grazing situations or continuous stacking, we could see these decreased carbohydrate stores in the roots, leading to reduced persistence, especially when the animal keeps going back to that young immature plant to keep grazing. When we rotationally stack, we're kind of forcing a rest period and not going back to those plants as quickly or not allowing those animals to go back to those plants as quickly. So we can start to see that increased persistence in these plants. Those root carbohydrates will have time to restore, and we potentially can see those increased yields by giving that plant time to continue to grow. And part of that is not just the interval, but also grazing heights. We don't want to graze it to the ground. Um, when we think about those carbohydrate stores, if we're thinking about those legumes and our clovers, typically those are stored underground, a lot of times in the roots and the crowns. And so general rule of thumb, those can be grazed typically lower, but we don't necessarily only have alfalfa and clovers in a pasture because we have bloat concerns, especially when you think about alfalfa, red clover, some higher bloat risk legumes. So we always typically have them mixed with the cool season grass. And with that, a lot of these actually store their carbohydrates in above ground tissues, such as our lower stems and tillers. And so as we start to graze them lower, we're going to be taking out that those carbohydrate reserves that that plant is relying on for that regrowth. Then when we get into our warm season grasses, they're even higher up in the above ground tissue. Typically, we're thinking not grazing those below 6 to 8 inches. There was a question earlier about grazing some warm season grasses, but we really want to make sure we don't graze those too low. We can be removing the structures that are going to allow that regrowth, but we're also going to be impacting carbohydrate stores. And so really balancing that interval grazing and the heights of those grazing is going to be very impactful in ensuring we have carbohydrate stores for regrowth, and that can help with our regrowth. And so when we're thinking about how plants grow, typically we see this S curve. What this S curve is basically the growth pattern most plants go through. They start off kind of slow, and then as they start to put on more plant material above ground, they start to go through this exponential growth phase, and they start growing really quickly, and then they start to taper off as we start entering reproductive growth. They slow down, don't put on as much biomass at that time. And so when I think about grazing, I like to think about trying to stay in this exponential phase. Because if we graze low, we're constantly pushing that plant back into a slower growth period because it has that reduced leaf area. And so we're pushing it slower back here, and it's going to take longer before we can recover. And so what that can look like is if we have moderate defoliation versus our severe defoliation, moderate defoliation, we're recovering a lot more quickly comparative to that severe defoliation because we're not going through that little lag phase at the beginning of that grazing. That plant's not having, it's not as, that plant's not as quick to recover because of that lag because we're grazing it so low. And so these are a lot of just kind of visualizations of this, but there's been work done in these realms really trying to explore this further. And this is an interesting work that was done out of the University of Missouri. And it was showing grazing impacts and how fast the plant can recover. And so they basically grazed down to a residual height of 2 inches and 4 inches. And so the 2 inches is in red, and the 4 inches is that blue dotted line. And they wanted to see how long it took basically for each of these to recover an additional ton, grow an additional ton of forage. And so what they found was that when they left it down to 2 inches, it took 64 days for those plants to grow an additional ton of forage. But when they took it down to 4 inches, gave it that 2 inches more, it only took 40 days to get back. That's a 2 week difference to get the same amount of tonnage back. One of the things I get a lot is, why would I leave that much forage out there? And it's for this reason exactly is that recovery, being those plants can recover much better when we leave that forage there. And so what you can see is that daily growth rate, that basically pounds per acre per day that forage is growing, is much higher for our 4 inch residual height compared to our 2 inch residual height. And so that's giving us a quicker recovery, potentially being able to go back to that field a little sooner in comparison to that 2 inch residual. Now, outside of that, there's a ton of other benefits, such as making sure our ground is covered. We're going to have better water infiltration, things like that, with living a better residual height. But it doesn't just impact the recovery of these plants and that above ground growth, but we're also in fact impacting what happens below ground. So this is looking at different basically grazing strategies. And so the first one is nothing's removed, the plant's just able to grow, keep producing biomass, produce those seed heads, and we see that basically roots continue to grow. What's interesting, if we have moderate grazing, where 30 to 40%, it actually should say 30 to 50% of the above ground biomass is removed, the roots, what happens below ground is basically root growth doesn't stop. 95 to 100% of those roots continue to grow because there's enough above ground biomass to keep below ground going as well. So everything we do above ground, we're also going to be seeing what happens below ground. As we get up to 70% removed, we're starting to see that 50% of those roots will stop growing for 17 days. For almost 2 weeks, over 2 weeks, those roots will not, 50% of them will not grow. And then when we get into really severely grazed pastures that really look like a golf course, all the roots will stop growing for 2 weeks. And so this is really setting us up to be susceptible for any type of drought or inclement weather coming forward. Because if the soils start to dry out and we only have a very short root system, we're going to start to see basically these plants are going to be struggling a lot sooner than plants that their roots are still were still able to grow and continue to grow, reaching lower levels, uh, water water levels in the soil. So not just above ground, we're doing a lot above ground, keeping that 4 inches versus that 2 inches. We are able to get more tonnage faster, but below ground, we're going to help keep those plants healthier and more resilient for basically inclement weather that could come. And many of us in Iowa and a lot of the United States right now, a lot of the United States is in drought. And so having better roots is going to be very important. And then in Iowa, a lot of times when fall hits, we do dry out a lot. And so having these roots is going to be very important for that. And so we have these roots, we want to keep them healthy. We want to keep the above ground growth healthy. One of the things that I get a lot is really thinking about that spring initial growth because we have that spring growth and then we have the regrowth that's going to be occurring later. And so I want to kind of discuss how these plants are growing and how that regrowth can occur. So our spring growth, our initial growth comes from tillers, and it's reliant on root reserves. And that since we're so reliant on root reserves, spring growth is very susceptible to being grazed low early. And so I know it's hard once things start greening up. We like animals are ready to go. They're ready to get out there, but we have to be careful because these are reliant on root reserves till about the 4 mature leaves that are on a single stem. Then we start to get to the point where the plant is not as reliant on those root reserves. And so what we can see here is in this diagram, this is just showing some growth stages of the plant. So we start kind of in um, very leafy stage. We start to see stem development. Then we get into stem elongation and getting into those reproductive stages here. What you see here is the red is what is called a growing point. It's the main growing point on the plant or apical meristems. And then the yellow is kind of where these auxiliary buds, or a lot of times people call basal buds, are. And so as the plant grows, that growing point, the apical meristem in our grasses, will start to move up the plant. Typically at the beginning, it stays low to the ground, if not below ground. And then as it gets into stem elongation, it starts to move up the plant, and then it forms into that inflorescence or that flower. And so that initial spring growth, most of our grasses, they only are perennial grasses, they flower in the spring. And so what happens if we graze these? And so when we remove the growing point, it can force our plants to tiller. And so if we graze below that growing point as it moves up the stem, we can force the plant to tiller and regrow from these basal buds. And then it pushes it back into vegetative growth. And with our cool season perennial grasses, when we force it back to vegetative growth, it typically stays in vegetative growth most of the rest of the season. And so when we're thinking about grazing, and what our spring grazing should look like, we have these two balances. We have this balance, we don't want to graze too early because if we graze early, we're going to put a lot of pressure on that plant that's growing from root reserves. And then we want to graze efficiently to try to remove these growing points as it moves up the plant so that we don't just have all these seed heads in the pasture. And when we get those seed heads, I get a lot of calls of, should I mow my pasture? Or do I not mow my pasture? And if we can graze efficiently, a lot of times the animal will remove that growing point um, as well. And so there's things I like to think about as we're thinking about that initial grazing period with that spring growth and regrowth. If we're continuous stocking, we want to wait till those plants are at least 8 to 10 inches tall. That's going to ensure that those plants can survive. They're not just reliant on those root reserves as they're grazing. But as we're thinking about rotational stocking, we can start earlier, but depending on how fast you're willing to move, can change how early we really can start grazing. So if we're grazing very, very quick moves in the spring, which can be very efficient, we can, if moving less than 24 hours, we can graze fairly early at 4 to 6 inches because the goal is we're just taking the tops off. We're just grazing the tops, leaving the rest of the plant behind. And we're just grazing very quickly. Now, if you don't want to do as quick of moves, we need to let that plant grow more. Going to that 6 to 8 inches, quick move, we still want quick moves with that. But if you're just thinking like weekly moves, going back to that 8 to 10 inches tall is going to be important to make sure those plants are safe. So now as that growing point starts to move up the plant during that stem elongation, what can occur is if we're thinking about continuous stocking versus rotational stocking, is animals typically choose leaves over stem. And so in certain areas of the pasture, if we're having plants that are still in vegetative growth in a continuous stocking situation, they're probably going to try to just pick those leaves off. And we may see more plants go to seed head, especially plants that may be further off and they just haven't grazed yet. Where in rotational stocking, we can kind of force the animal to select or not, sorry, we can force the animals to not be as picky or they can't choose it, especially with those very quick moves. We can make them eat that stem, removing that growing point and forcing those plants back to vegetative growth. And these are just some things to be thinking about as we're thinking about that spring initial growth. One thing is spring, that is our first step of the year. Let's make it a good one. If you're concerned, holding off and putting your animals out there too early, holding them off and letting that plant grow is going to be a better choice than letting them out too early because that's going to set the pace for the rest of the season. And spring is typically our best growing time for our cool season plants. So really, just trying to start off on the right foot is going to be very important. I know Megan had mentioned this and talked about it for a second, but we have these seasonal growth patterns. It's not always going to produce equivalently throughout the season. And so sometimes we're going to have very quick regrowth and sometimes it's going to slow down. And so if we're looking at those cool season grasses, really good spring growth, summer it declines, doesn't grow as well. And then in the fall, it starts to pick up again. This is just a graph that shows kind of how having a mixture or just different species on the farm can help fill those gaps throughout the season. But when we're starting to think about that and thinking about that in-season management, there's some things we should be considering. And so we need to be thinking about the forage type on how much residual we should leave behind to ensure that we have that growth. So a lot of our cool season perennial grasses, we're thinking 3 to 4 inches or higher, leaving that residual behind. Our warm season perennials, more than 8 inches. And then you can get into some specific species, but really just making sure we're leaving the right residual height behind. And one rule of thumb that generally works fairly well is take half, leave half of it behind. Leave half of the dry matter behind for that regrowth. And we're going to start to see better returns because that plant's going to be able to recover more quickly. We're going to stay in that exponential growth and we're going to be able to have that recovery and those roots being able to continue to grow. As we're thinking about that seasonal growth that I was talking about just a second ago, that's also going to impact the rest period we want for our grasses. So rotational stacking allows for those plants to rest, and that's what's so valuable. And so in the spring, typically we don't have to rest as long because we have that really high growth rate during the spring for our cool season grasses, 20 to 30 days, where in the summer, they slow down a lot due to their photosynthetic pathway. And so then we're thinking about resting for even longer for 40 plus days. And that can be true in drought situations as well. And then finally, in the fall, approximately 30 days rest period can be valuable in ensuring those plants have time to regrow. And so all of these things interact, our rest period and those grazing intervals to the residual height to ensure that we're giving our plants the best chance for growth and regrowth in these situations. And so that leads me into my last couple slides, and it's really focusing on how grazing management impacts that growth. And so one of the things I like to think about is so in a continuously stocked situations, we allow animal preference to choose. They're going to start choosing green material over growing or over dead material, young versus mature, leaves over stems, typically legumes over grasses as well. And I've even had people that'll be like, if I have grasses in a mixture, they'll eat, say, meadow fescue over orchard grass or Timothy over orchard grass over tall fescue. And so if we give them the opportunity, they're going to choose what they want. And if we do that, when we will start to see that basically preferred plants are going to be grazed and they're going to weaken and probably thin out. So plants the animals like to eat are going to thin out faster. They're going to avoid grazing more mature plants with lots of stems and seed heads. And then we're going to start to see this patchiness because we're going to see that shrinking of the desirable species. We might start seeing weed species encroach in, especially if they're weed species that the animal doesn't want to eat. We're going to start to see these different effects. And so overall, we're going to see a declining plant diversity and reduced long-term carrying capacity. And one thing that we will start to see is a lot of times around the water, we're going to have very heavy utilization before, and then as the further away from the water we go, we're going to start to see those plants not being utilized. And then when they get mature, they're going to be avoided. They're not going to be eaten because the animal is going to be able to come over here, eat this fresh growth. And then when these plants start to regrow, they're going to be able to go back to that and they're going to be selecting that young over that mature material. And so what rotational stocking can do is it forces them in a smaller area and they're going to be able to utilize that or force them to utilize it more evenly. And so we're going to get that better utilization. We're going to see that rest and recovery. Those grazed paddocks are going to give time to regrow. Most likely, we're going to start to see more maintain that diversity because we're not going to allow the animals just to select for one species over another. And overall, we're going to be able to maximize productivity in that plant persistence. And so as we're looking at this diagram, basically as the animal has been grazing here, we have a paddocks that have been rested and are regrowing. And then by the time we get back to it after those 30 days of rest, which is an average value we look at, these plants are going to be able to regrow and have plenty of forage for the animals to eat. And with that, thank you for your time today. And I think it's time for questions.